In this video, I'm going to address an argument by David Long that consciousness is emergent, and that it requires brains and bodies, or equipment, as he puts it, to exist. David presents this argument in a video on his channel titled Integral Emergentism, Sword and the Stone Challenge. Now I'll play the part from that video where he presents it.
Consciousness is not the primary thing in this universe. Consciousness is a very new thing that requires certain equipment to even exist. And as equipment has evolved and developed over time, more and more functions of consciousness and capacities have come online. We have one-to-one correlations between equipment and functions of consciousness, or between like hardware and software, where you damage parts of the brain and specific aspects of consciousness are lost.
Okay, so I'll just break some of that down a little bit to make it perhaps a little bit more clear if it wasn't already clear enough. So by equipment, or by biological equipment, he's obviously talking about biological facts, whatever those biological facts are. And I think that's the only relevant thing to understand here for our purposes. And by functions of consciousness, I guess he's talking about mental functions. And again, I think the only relevant thing to understand here for our purposes is that he's talking about facts about consciousness, whatever those facts are. And the empirical considerations he appeals to in making his argument, furthermore, are that as certain biological facts have evolved, certain mental functions or facts about consciousness have arisen, and that by damaging certain parts of the brain, certain mental functions or facts about consciousness are lost. Okay, so those are the empirical considerations he appeals to. And his argument essentially consists merely of appealing to these empirical considerations. And that, I claim, does not achieve anything significant. It's rather hand-wavy. It does not demonstrate the claim that I presume is intended to be demonstrated, which I presume is that consciousness is emergent and it requires equipment to exist, or at least that we can definitively conclude that in light of the evidence he appeals to. Okay, to demonstrate this claim, I think David needs to state, in virtue of what we can supposedly definitively conclude that consciousness is emergent, or that it requires to exist biological equipment, in light of the evidence he appeals to. In other words, in simpler words, he has to make clear what it is about the evidence that convinces him of this view, right? There actually has to be something about the evidence that convinces one of this. In other words, there has to be some consideration in virtue of which we can supposedly definitively conclude this view in light of the evidence. And in a previous interaction I had with David Long on Facebook, I asked him essentially to state this. And his reply was that what it was about the evidence that convinces him of this is that the evidence is good evidence. Now, this is obviously a silly reply, because it basically begs the question, or pushes the question. Because what is essentially being asked is what it is about the evidence that makes it good evidence. Right? What is it that makes it good evidence? That's pretty much what we're asking. But he did not make clear what it was about the evidence that makes it good, or what it is about the evidence that convinces him of this view. He didn't state such a consideration. So, and in the absence of stating it, he has not demonstrated his claim that, he has not managed to successfully demonstrate his claim that consciousness is emergent and it requires to exist biological equipment. He has not demonstrated this claim that we can definitively conclude that in light of the evidence. That has not been shown. In that same Facebook interaction, moreover, David presented a syllogistic argument for his view. This syllogistic argument does not, however, contain the relevant consideration. But I thought I'd address it here anyway, because in virtue of the fact that the argument was syllogistic, I always appreciate syllogistic arguments because they make clear and explicit the inference or the logical reasoning via which a conclusion in question is drawn. There's no ambiguity or vagueness around that. And I always appreciate that, so that makes me want to address the argument. The argument goes like this. The argument that David presented goes like this. Premise 1. One-to-one correlations show us that developed biological equipment allows for functions of consciousness. Premise 2. There was a time before developed biological equipment evolved. Premise 3. Non-living things show no sign of having functions of consciousness, in spite of not having developed biological equipment. Conclusion. Functions of consciousness emerged with the evolution of developed biological equipment. Now, I think this argument is not a good argument for his view, because the conclusion of the argument expresses a different proposition from the proposition that his view or claim expresses, that consciousness emerged with the evolution of developed biological equipment. But the conclusion of this syllogistic argument concludes not that consciousness emerged with the evolution of developed biological equipment, but that functions of consciousness did. Okay. So, since these are different propositions, different conclusions, the conclusion of this syllogistic argument is a red herring. It's irrelevant. And, so it's not a good argument for its view. And that gets me to my final thoughts on it in this video. And those are that neither the syllogistic argument I just presented or the argument from David's video that appealed merely to empirical considerations, neither of those arguments manages to successfully demonstrate the claim that we can supposedly definitively conclude in light of the evidence that consciousness requires to exist biological equipment, or that consciousness is emergent. And because that claim was not demonstrated by either argument, David should not use either of these arguments as his knockdown argument for his view. I think that's kind of silly. And that's it for this video. Peace.